hello everybody, and welcome to episode 119 of Cookie Pocket. I am Zach, and I'm joined by my usual co-host Mitchell and Christian, but
Hi.
My fellow co-host may have realized that I'm holding my microphone in my hand for the first time in a couple of seasons, and that's because my mic stand is in a different room with our fourth host for this episode.
It was stolen.
Would you care to introduce yourself, our fourth guest host?
Hello, I'm Gloria. I'm Zach's girlfriend, and I don't know a lot about movies, but Zach has taught me, so we'll see where that gets me today.
Gloria,
Zach has taught us too.
He hasn't taught me anything.
Gloria, as well as being my girlfriend, is also a graphic designer. She's designed the posters for my movies One Shot and The Search for Alexander, so if you contributed to the crowdfunding campaign for Search for Alexander, you definitely saw
poster.
her artwork.
Yeah.
And it didn't occur to me until this morning when I was thinking about the movie we were watching, how appropriate it is that I brought my girlfriend to the band sessions to talk about Lennon Naked.
This is my graphic designer. She's also my girlfriend.
I mentioned this last episode, but you can kind of tell when I planned this season, because I planned the season in the fall of 2020 when I was really listening. I was going through a full discography listen of the Beatles for the first time, and I happened to come across the Wikipedia for this movie, and I thought, well, this will be great. It's a BBC TV movie about John Lennon, one of my favorite musicians. It stars Christopher Eccleston, who is one of my favorite British actors. Surely this will be a slam dunk. We've got to talk about it on the podcast. And I don't necessarily know if any of those statements were true. But before I go too deep into my own thoughts, let's just toss it out to general thoughts like we always do. What did you guys think about Lennon Naked?
I kind of want to throw Mitchell in the deep end on this one.
Why would you do this to me? Don't ask me what happened, all right? I remember more in this movie than Dune, David Lynch, all right? Well, now I have to think about my thoughts right away. This is true Lieutenant energy right now.
I thought because of the Beatle context, maybe hearing from you first would be intriguing.
That is a great idea. So I am not a huge Beatles fan. I'm gonna keep saying that. I think it's gonna get worse at this rate. We're choosing the wrong films for that, I guess. But I did find points in this that I enjoyed. We're gonna start with the positives. I was really intrigued by how they were gonna handle certain events I've heard of and things I've kind of read about and heard out of context, and just kind of seeing it in a linear fashion. And I can tell right away, just going off of basic expectations for kind of a mockumentary or a biopic or something, that you have to have a certain level of context. And I feel like a lot of I'm going to make a guess. I'm going to say a lot of the context in this is probably more so audience driven, and you're kind of expected to know some things that are going on. I feel like a lot of it was that event that happened, and I was fully accepting that was going to happen, and that's not a knock against the film at all. I think that is a viable strategy. If the lead is actually really good at acting, if there's some semblance of a drive or some semblance of a conflict happening. And I didn't really get that. I got some interpersonal conflict. I got a little bit of background into his life that I didn't know about, and have I'm just pretending like everything I saw was 100% true, obviously, because I know it wasn't. But just having that extra background is good, and just having extra context on a musician's life. And I understand that there's a lot of subtlety and complexity to a lot of events of his life. He went through various different phases and different relationships, both with the Beatles and with women, and it just is very hard to pin down in that short amount of time and with that budget. So you're already fighting an uphill battle with that. And that just came across to me immediately. Right away, also the Eccleston accent. I know we're going to freaking talk about it.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the first one to say it. That was very distracting. But yeah, I just got the sense I wasn't accepting him as a holistic person. I wasn't accepting him as oh, he's like a really bad person, but he has some good elements to him and some semblance of hope. There's really not anything to latch onto. I latched onto the fact that he was just being a prick to everybody the whole time. And that was basically my biggest takeaway.
Bingo.
And that's very sad. It's very sad. I know that's not 100% true. And just for somebody that knows very, very little about Lennon and not a whole lot about the Beatles in general, I immediately picked up on that. And that was a very big detractor for me. Now, there was some funny scenes. There was some funny moments. There's some really, pretty much right when they got nude, there was a lot of very good, well-framed shots that were very funny, very engaging and surprising. And Eccleston does have some pretty funny lines, in my opinion. And there is like some semblance of character development in that regard as he gets progressively frustrated, and there is some arc with his dad and stuff like that. But ultimately, it just comes tumbling down in the end for me.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm trying to mitigate how much of this I couch in my Beatles fandom. I'm wearing my Beatles t-shirt quite appropriately. I guess I'll start with the positives too, like Mitchell did. I think the biggest positive here for me is Rory Kinnear's very brief turn as Brian Epstein. I think he's pretty great. And sort of like how Mitchell said, this film really depends on you having a pretty strong context of the Beatles. And I think probably the deepest example of this is that scene with Epstein and John's sort of iffy interactions with him, I think depend on the viewer knowing that Brian Epstein was gay. And I don't know if the film says it, but to me, at least, I don't think it did. Maybe it implies that at some point.
I didn't know that.
But
it is definitely implied.
I didn't know that.
But they
I don't think
like,
I knew that either.
And if you don't know who he is, then you're not going to necessarily know either. You might just think John's teasing him.
Yeah, I would have had no clue if I wasn't like such a nerd about this stuff. But at some point, John makes kind of an offensive joke that implies that Brian is gay, and at that time he was not out because there would obviously be drastic consequences for him if he were. And to me, that's kind of like a promising moment that shows how John like ribs with him because he's close, but he's also like clearly pushing it too far. And it's also a function of John's own insecurity that he's having these moments with people that he genuinely loves. So that was kind of interesting. But then the accent hit me really hard at the beginning as being super distracting, almost like the Benoit Blanc accent that Daniel Craig does for Knives Out. And with that, I'm like, ooh, this is weird. I don't know if I like it. And then it keeps going and I kind of settle into it. And I'll admit that something similar happened here. I don't know that I necessarily accepted it, but I just tuned it out. But I think what bothered me a lot more is his age. John Lennon in this era is in his late 20s. And Eccleston was like, 56, I think. Oh,
I thought he was 45, but he's still too old.
he's definitely in his 50s. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but he is old, and it's kind of a function of how easy it is to forget how young the Beatles were when they were doing all this stuff. And I think their youth is kind of an important detail when you think about all the pressure that John and Paul are facing, and they're sort of clashing. And yeah, so those are kind of the opening things that linger with me the most. But on the whole, it's a disappointing film. I gave it a 2, sort of grading on the TV movie scale. So I don't know if it's necessarily better than the 1.5s I've given on the pod recently. But yeah, just kind of disappointing, I think.
Okay. Gloria, what did you think?
My expectations were very low because they were low because I was like, I don't know much about the Beatles, and I'd say like 90% of what I know is from Zach. So I was like, okay, it'll just be some sort of perspective on one of them as opposed to all 4 of them together. Some fact, some fiction in there. And yeah, I mean, agreeing with what you guys said earlier, like I was watching it and I was like, yeah, he's just a jerk. Like, even if you are hurt, there's a way to like not be terrible to your wife and your child, and like there's a way to do things, and he's just not. And Zach and I had a long, in-depth conversation after the movie about how, like, because we watched it together, about how like being famous is like a crazy thing, and then being famous at that young of an age is also crazy. So like he had a lot of things that he was going through. Doesn't necessarily justify, but it gives a reasoning for his behavior. But yeah, and it was also interesting just because like it picked up at a weird time in the Beatles' trajectory. And like, I guess, because when it started, I was like, wait, where are we? And then I figured out like at what point in the timeline we were. And then once the movie had ended, I was kind of dissatisfied. I was like, I feel like we need something to close it off nicer. And I mean, Zach can talk more about it, but we were talking about how that felt incomplete.
Yeah, I guess that's a good tee up, Gloria, to the point we kind of talked about after watching the movie, where, at least to me, it kind of feels like this is the middle film in like a trilogy of TV movies that doesn't exist. But this really does feel like there was a first movie where they talk about the Beatles forming and John's relationship with Paul and the band and with Brian. And then this is the middle movie where things kind of fall apart for him. And then there's a third movie where he gets his life back on track with Yoko and kind of finds himself. And then just when his life is about to go in a very new direction, potentially a better direction, he's tragically shot and killed. But as is, it just kind of feels like the middle chunk of a much longer story. And arguably, I think the most interesting bits of the story of John Lennon aren't included here. Now, that's not to say this has to be like a cradle to grave biopic, but kind of the irritating thing for me is that, yes, John Lennon was a very complicated man, and we can't necessarily say that the official story on his life is, oh, that's what he was really like. But it does feel like this movie really portrays every decision and action in his life during this window of about 1967 to 1971 as having been motivated just by anger and rage and lashing out. And that was certainly part of it, but I do think there was more to John's character at the time and more to his experimentation than just that. And it does leave him kind of feeling like a one-note character. I gave this film a 2 out of 5. I was quite disappointed by it, I think. And I mentioned that I really like Christopher Eccleston, but I think he's actually giving quite a poor performance in this, if I'm totally honest. I think because of the voice. I think he's doing this. I mean, I was most reminded of the voice that Paul Rudd does when he plays John Lennon in like a 5-minute bit in Walk Hard, because he's really going for that. I'm John Lennon, and it's so like stereotypical. It sounds like a party trick impression. And it's really bad. I think there's scenes where it kind of drops out. There's a scene where John is going through primal scream therapy, and Eccleston kind of loses the accent there a little bit. And I think he manages to, that moment is actually very, I think, impressive in its emotion, and it really communicates this extremely traumatic memory of John's to the viewer. But then after that, we just slingshot right back into, hi, the Beatles, and it loses it again. But I guess I want to hit more on the tone a little more specifically, because something that Gloria kind of commented when we finished watching this film was, I think you said something like, I don't know what that movie was trying to say, or I don't know why that movie needed to exist. So
pretty much, yeah. I was like, especially as someone who doesn't know a lot about like the lore of the Beatles, like I'm not like a super fan, and I feel like this movie caters towards super fans, because if you don't know much, like I know their music, I don't know the story of anything. So for me watching this, I was like, well, why would I want to listen to them? Like he was just a jerk, and Paul talked for 5 minutes, and then the George and Ringo like did nothing. So I was like, I don't know. It felt like, yeah, I was like, what was the point of showing us this window of his life? Because he seemed to be the most angry, and like he was creative, but he was a jerk. I don't know.
So yeah. What do we think the point was, I guess?
Man, I just want to echo more of the problems that Gloria has brought up. But I think maybe they're trying to do this sort of epic exploration of all of John's biggest relationships, I guess, starting very briefly with Brian, and jumping to kind of Paul and Cynthia and Yoko. But I think maybe, and of course his father, which by the way, he didn't have all those reunions with his father. That's like complete fiction.
Nah.
But I think maybe trying to do all of those together renders all of them kind of moot. I'm intrigued at the idea of exploring, in particular, his relationship with Paul during this time, because, and they allude to this briefly, there is this idea that Paul is kind of driving the band more at the late stages. He kind of came up with the Sgt. Pepper conceit and rallied them to make Abbey Road and all this other stuff. But I guess Andrew Scott's accent is kind of equally disappointing to me in terms of being like a stereotypical Paul accent. The point.
While you ruminate on that, I do think Andrew Scott does a pretty good job of, he's got Paul's physicality down. Like he's really got the gestures down, because Paul at that time, he like held his face in his hands a lot, and he does a lot of like small hand gestures that Andrew Scott like nails. But he's going, I don't know if it's quite a stereotypical Paul, but in trying to get that kind of lilting effect, he just goes so deep into Paul's register. Yes. And it at points it's like off-putting. Like, what are you doing?
I think this becomes a lot more important when you're talking about like a creative artist, because their voice matters significantly more. And like the thousands upon thousands, 10,000s, hundreds of thousands of freaking hours of Beatles footage there is out in the ether, that they're like some of the most hyper analyzed human beings that have ever existed on Earth in terms of media. And I just feel like the standard should be a hell of a lot higher. And you should be a lot more careful and considerate about how you're doing a character analysis sort of biopic, rather than something like, we talked about Walk the Line. Somehow I always end up bringing back Walk the Line. We talk about musical biopics, but that was a lot more about it used the music as a development factor, like that it kind of helped you latch onto something because everybody knows about the songs, so you latch onto the songs. And I understand, I can definitely get the point of this, that it wasn't about the music, it wasn't about the Beatles, it was about Lennon as a person. And if you're gonna do that much of a character analysis of someone, you might as well be a lot more holistic about it, and be a little bit more considerate about nuances of his personality and how he eventually became the Lennon that everyone knew, or maybe like how it has to be somehow supplemental to what we already know about Lennon, or even if it isn't, it has to show you something new that could interest someone that didn't know anything about him, because otherwise it's just going to look like a random dude with a really terrible accent, and it's going to make Zach feel like an honorary Liverpoolian defending the homeland, because it's incredibly frustrating to hear that accent.
But Christian, I think we've given you some hibernation time on the purpose.
Wake up.
It's interesting. I'll go back to what you were saying. I think it was you, Zach, if I remember correctly, about the sort of end of this era of John being him, in a sense, recovering or getting back on his feet now that he's with Yoko and he's kind of happy again. And I don't know. I guess you could say that the purpose was that he eventually finds himself through at the end of all of this like trauma exploration. But I still think, like Gloria was saying, it's such an unflattering depiction of him that it's really hard to buy the conclusion that Yoko solved all of his personal problems and that everything was just okay by the end of this. And the scenes with his father too, they make me think of, this is kind of a bizarre comparison, but deleted scenes from The Amazing Spider-Man 2. That is the specifically the second Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movie, because they try to dig into Peter Parker's parents more in those films. And there's this idea that his dad is like a secret agent. And there are deleted scenes in the second one where he like shows up at, I think it's someone's grave. I don't know. Peter's mourning someone and his dad shows up, and then he like turns to his dad and he's like, "Why are you here? Why you think you could just show up now and everything's okay?" And it's like Andrew Garfield, amazing actor, pouring his whole heart and soul into the scene, but it just kind of doesn't work because it's a little cookie cutter, and it doesn't make a lot of sense in context, and that's why the scenes were cut. And here it's like replacing the father he never met with Yoko, or somehow like ditching the Beatles, or casting Paul as the villain. I think it's too confused, and it's especially not clear that John is happy or complete as a person.
Something I thought they were going to try to do was establish almost like a comparison between John and his father, because I'm not sure how accurate this is, but in the film they mention this idea that John's father abandoned the family when he was very young, and then they established that he's found this other woman and he has another family, and he's happy with that family, and he feels like he got it right the second time. And when John confronts him about it in this film, he says, "Oh, well, I did my best." And that kind of reflects John's own situation, where he had a family way too young. He neglected his son and his wife. And then the second time round with Yoko, he had Sean, his second son, who he deliberately took time out from music and stayed home to be a stay-at-home dad, and was determined to do it right the second time around. And, you know, I did my best the first time, and I thought they were going to make some kind of point of comparison there, but Sean never shows up in this movie. So that was another thing that it felt like we're missing the third episode in John Lennon, the story or whatever that would have concluded that arc. I think the purpose, I mentioned this in my Letterboxd, I think the point really of this is what it says on the tin. It's to expose John Lennon naked, to show the man for his flaws and his faults and his troubled background. And I think that's kind of an interesting idea, I guess. But I feel like even by 2010, that had really been done already. I think that people were already fascinated by John Lennon for a long time by the time this movie came out. And I think people mostly knew about that kind of thing. So I am kind of equally befuddled by it. And I did find myself by the end kind of agreeing with Gloria in terms of, well, what is the point here? And kind of an image that stuck with me is at the end, you see John and Yoko get on the plane. They're going to America. They make a point of saying in the end text that he never returned to Britain. And as he's getting on the plane, he does this like jaunty little dance on the stairs on the way up. And I think that's based on actual footage. I imagine he actually did that, or they're basing it off of footage from some point. But I found myself thinking, I don't really believe that this John would do that jaunty little dance, because John at the end of this movie does not feel like he's emotionally changed and become a different John to the John that he was at the beginning, who kicked Julian's football away. So yeah, I do think it's definitely muddled, and I don't really know if it gets around to the point that it's trying to make, really. Christian.
Yeah, I have sort of a question for our two less Beatlemaniac hosts here, Mitchell and Gloria. Interestingly enough, this TV film does incorporate some of John's solo catalog.
Yeah.
None of John's Beatle music, interestingly enough. But I wanted to ask you guys what you made of the songs, of their inclusion, the way in which they were included, and just that whole thing. Did you think that it was an effective sort of evocation of what the story or the point of the film was, or was it just kind of distracting or confusing?
Gloria can go first.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I only remember two specific instances where where either he played or in the background they played real music. Am I correct in that? Like real music from his discography, is that correct?
Yeah, there's that one scene where he like plays a bit for his dad, and then there's a couple spots where it just pops up in the background, I think.
Or at least we see him and Yoko making the music.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
I have heard a little bit more of the Yoko collaborative album because of Zach when he was listening to it. And I was just like,
well, you're still with him, so.
So something happened, right? No, I mean, like, I think it's very interesting and artistic, but like, would I willingly listen to an album of a woman screaming? Probably not. I know Zach really likes it, and you know what? I love that Zach likes different things from me. But I mean,
Thank you, dear.
I
That's
did.
very generous.
Of course. I did think it was kind of weird how they didn't play any Beatles music, like even in the background, like any like acoustic, just like little like instrumentals in the back, but whatever. Yeah, no, I did think it was interesting that they did that, but I don't think we heard like a ton. But because I wasn't sure what was based on fact and what was just kind of like the director decided to add in, whenever something happened, I'd be like, Zach, did that happen in real life? And he was like, yeah, that's an actual song. So as a viewer, I couldn't really tell if something was more fabricated or if it was true. Yeah.
That could be good or bad, but I had a similar experience. There was a couple that I could tell it was probably really Lennon singing. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about it isn't really about the Beatles or about the discography. It's more about John Lennon himself, and that there's already an expectation that you've probably listened to every Lennon song, and you're like, you have the glasses on, you're like, like waiting for like the song to come up, and it comes up, you're like, oh yeah, and Christian's like, oh, I'm gonna give it a 2 instead of a 1.5. Let's go.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, so I appreciated. That was another positive I neglected to mention. I really liked the inclusion of them, and I also thought that scene with Yoko was freaking hilarious. Definitely matched the vibe. It's one of those things where if you film it deliberately enough and you show enough emotion and rawness in a certain moment, that you can really get a lot out of that. You can really see where the relationship was developing without actually getting into the entire relationship. So I liked that kind of insinuation that you can make even if you don't really know much about them. So that's like pretty much the end of my positives about it. But yeah, I enjoyed the inclusion for sure.
I feel like if they wanted this movie to end on kind of a definitive closing point, not that it really is one, but they could have ended on the release of John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, because that is that's the summation, that's the result of his primal scream therapy. That's what he harnessed a lot of that into. They play Mother at one point, and does God play over the credits?
I think so. And they also played Look at Me at the beginning, which is on that album too.
I mean, God is a great choice of a final credits song, because that's very much his kind of definitive statement on, I'm leaving this portion of my life behind. And if they'd made that album into more of a closing statement, this is a new phase in John's life, I think that would have been a good idea. I appreciated hearing a lot of the early Lennon music, especially, I mean, I don't love Life with the Lions, which is the second Lennon-Ono collaborative album. I did think it was cool that they recreate the album cover in the movie. There is lots of attention to detail on Lennon's life and the iconography of Lennon's life, which I appreciated. The cover of that second album is John lying down on the floor next to Yoko's hospital bed, which happens in this film in a couple scenes. But I really like Two Virgins, the first Yoko John album. So I was glad to see such a point made of that, because, like it or not, that is a significant moment in his life and in their relationship. That's basically the sounds of their first date. Something we're kind of getting into like specific, or I'm kind of getting into specific iconography, but I was surprised that they didn't include when John first went to Yoko's art gallery. I don't know if you've heard about this, Christian, but there's the first time they not the first time they met necessarily, but Yoko invited John to a gallery, and there was an art piece where you got up on a ladder and there was a magnifying glass at the top of the ladder, and you looked through it at a note on the ceiling, and the note just said yes. And nowadays we probably look back on that as very pretentious performance art. But John found it very meaningful, and I'm quoting directly here, so excuse the language, but there's a quote that I find very funny where John said that he thought it was lovely that it said yes and not something more negative like no or fuck you. And I thought it was weird that they didn't include that, since that was such a meaningful moment for him, I guess.
That is fascinating. And another summation of how much of this is inherently contradictory, because I mean, that I think Two Virgins and the Plastic Ono Band album it feels like some of John's angriest output. So it's interesting to hear him say that he was drawn to Yoko's positivity. And maybe I'm retreading an old point about how this film is trying to juggle Paul and Brian and his dad and Yoko and Cynthia. But I think probably the biggest failure, if they're trying to show Lennon naked and get to this end point of post Beatles, I think they needed to do a lot more with Yoko, both in terms of portraying her as her own artist, because that's a huge part of why John loved her so much. And I guess we get that moment where he's like passing by her gallery, and there's that other moment where she's like, "We're perfect," after he says she's perfect. But it still feels like it falls short of capturing the enigmatic person that she was. I know there's these narratives that she was manipulative or talentless, or what I think whatever you think of her art or her as an artist, the fact that John was so fascinated by her and the fact that what she was doing was so iconoclastic merits more exploration.
That might be a good point of group discussion, because Yoko's reputation is a very big part of this era of the Beatles, and especially of John's life. And so many people, especially older fans, are still likely to say that Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles. So I'm curious, Mitchell, Gloria, how did you come away from this feeling about Yoko and her employment in the story? Not necessarily her art as it appears within the story, but just how her character was presented. Anyone can begin.
Well, it doesn't help that the actress was drunk for much of the production. Does not help. Maybe it helps a little bit. I don't know. Maybe, don't know how Yoko did, but that's I did. This kind of falls into what I was saying about the believability of the relationship. I mean, I don't have the context. I'm not massive genius or big Yoko fan. Gonna wager I probably would not like the later discography. I'm just gonna guess. It's a complete guess. No background information. Just throwing it out there. Pretty sure I wouldn't like it, but nevertheless, yeah, I think that would have been something that even could have been explored a lot earlier in the film, even, or maybe just kind of what you're talking about, Zach, like just going even further and talking about later events. I feel like would have helped, but I mean, yeah, just from like pure guesstimation, I just don't think I got enough experience with him at all. Like, I just really don't feel like I got enough information to latch onto or got anything that was intriguing. It was kind of just like, well, this is just how it is. He's at a press conference and he's just pissed at everybody and he's making himself look awful, and then he's rubbing up on Yoko, taking pictures of her naked and recording crazy stuff, and then now they're hanging out, and then there's all this legal trouble and adultery, and it's just like all I'm learning is terrible things. I'm not learning anything endearing. I'm not learning anything about Yoko, or even just, let's just say, like, it was purely just a lust thing or something. Like, I'm not saying that's how it was. I'm just saying, let's just say it was just a lust story. Like, there's still no investment. There's still no, like, this is something that really happened. There's nothing that's grounding you in the story. And I think that's the big problem. So I would have definitely liked a lot more time with her. I kind of appreciate her acting. It was pretty good, I guess. I mean, based on what I saw from like the first bit of Get Back, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I don't really have a lot of reference points, but yeah, just not enough context.
That is a decent point, that a lot of what they show in the movie is very matter of fact. And it kind of feels like, well, this is here because it happened. Did you expect it not to be here? And maybe that is part of the point, is just that it's very frank and just lays everything out on the table. But I don't know. I feel like you can do that in a documentary. I feel like you can do that in a cinema verite documentary where you go, I'm just filming what happened. But as soon as you're filming a narrative with actors who are playing roles in a script, you can't really say it just happened anymore, because you're generating something. You're filling in gaps that may or may not have happened in a given setting. But Gloria, how did you feel about Yoko?
Well, honest first impression, or not first impression, first thing that comes to my mind is that I thought it was hysterical when they were like, come on, man, she's breaking up the band. And she was just sitting on an amp, just like there. Not to be like this, but I'm like, why are we villainizing a woman for just existing? Like, maybe we should calm down for a second. That's definitely what I took from it. And also, I think, maybe she did break up the band. I wasn't there. I don't really know. But I think if anything, I think she and John like this. They're a great match for each other. As I said to Zach, I said they matched each other's freak. I was like, I have never seen two people that are like meant to be with each other except for them. Obviously, I don't approve of the cheating. So like, I would love if that did not happen. But like, oh my gosh, they were meant for each other. But I think if she, quote unquote, broke up the band in any way, it would be only because she like allowed John to like fully explore anything that he wanted to artistically. Whereas in a band with other guys, and especially, I don't know everything about the details of them, but like when you're on a label, when you're targeting your music towards teenage girls, like they want a specific sound. So him being like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to make this. I want to go off with her and scream into a microphone. Like, sure, go for it. So yeah, I think if anything, she freed him from what his situation was. Don't necessarily agree with the whole cheating thing, but it seems to be like it seems like he was happier once he was, quote unquote, free of his ex-wife, the Beatles, whatever management he was with, the circumstances that, that he was in. So yeah, Yoko, funny, weird. She's so authentic. And like everything I know about her, I know from Zach, and like, which scary, I know. But it sounds like she played her very well. And for being like the most prominent female actress, yeah. In the movie, I'm like, I think she did a really good job because that was a very male-dominated cast, and like, I don't know, Zach could tell you, but I'm always gravitated towards the women in movies that we watch, and I pretty much exclusively am like, okay, but what about the women? What did they think? What did they go through? So yeah, don't villainize her, but don't cheat. That's what I have to say about her.
Oh, fair enough.
Hoes before bros.
Okay.
Yeah, and there might be some bias in Gloria pointing out that she does know a lot about Yoko for me, because I'm kind of a Yoko fan. I don't like all of her albums.
Kind of, Zach.
You can't be kind of. You either are or you aren't.
I like Yoko quite a bit. I own her album Fly. I have it on CD, and I just listen to it in the car.
Not with me in the car.
I have to admit, when I'm driving around in the summer with the windows down, it's probably pretty alarming for pedestrians to hear 20 minutes of Yoko screaming coming out of my windows. But I like Yoko in the way that I like, when we talked about David Lynch, I brought up Jackson Pollock. And I think Yoko kind of does auditorily what Jackson Pollock does, where she lays down what could be interpreted as total nonsense. And I appreciate how you kind of bring some of your own meaning to it. And the art is as much you as it is her. I appreciate that, but I definitely get why a lot of people don't really like that sound. Yeah, we've kind of reached the end of my questions. This is kind of a slight episode, but I do think maybe that's appropriate because this ended up being kind of a slight film. It's only 80 something minutes, and I don't
Roasted.
I don't know if there's much meat on its bones. But is there anything else that you guys wanted to talk about? Any final points we wanted to bring up before we move on to the rundown?
I guess the sort of another big mistake that it makes that we haven't delved into as much as the Yoko stuff is I guess, perpetuating this duopoly of Paul and John, especially late in the Beatles. I think a huge part of their, and Gloria very rightly guessed this, the sort of constraints of being in a band weighing on them. But it wasn't just Paul and John. George was emerging in a huge way as a writer at this point. And it's weird seeing like Ringo talk a lot more than George. I guess they're really hammering home the quiet Beatle stereotype for George. But George was really getting up there. And I mean, during Get Back, he's the first one to quit, albeit temporarily. And I think it's clever of them to include that bit where Paul is the one to break the news that the group's splitting up after John does it privately, and then Paul gets a solo album out first. So there's kind of that, but it's just weird seeing George and Ringo get like 2 throwaway lines, and they're sort of relegated to the bench.
And seeing John Lennon, and the first question you ask him is, "Where's Ringo?" That was a genius line. I would have asked the same thing.
Yeah, I do think I think honestly Ringo gets a little more than George does, because George,
Definitely.
I can't remember anything that he says in the movie, and I think Ringo at least has one good line where he brings up like, I kind of liked it better when we were managed by Brian, and he would just kind of hand us sweaty fivers after a session, because at least the money was ours and it was in our hand then. Now we're kind of trapped in this big reputation management spiral. And that's at least kind of a memorable line that makes a point about where they are, versus George saying, "I agree," or "no," or something like that. I can't remember his lines. Yeah, that is a good point though, because you mentioned in your Letterboxd review, Christian, this line that Lennon has in the movie, this very heated, "The Beatles were my band, not his," which it feels very very musical biopic trailer parody. It almost feels like you'd see it in like a Tropic Thunder trailer for like a fictional band or something. "The band was mine," as you throw something across the room or something.
It's literally like Jack Black, that song he's improvising in School of Rock. "The band is mine."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else, Mitchell, Christian? Anything else you guys wanted, or Gloria?
Don't care about me.
Anything else you guys wanted to comment on?
No, it's fine. I'll just go. Bye.
You're gonna hear about that for the next week.
I'm
Oh,
sure
yeah.
we will.
Well, that's all I got. I'm done being frustrated. I'm done with the Beatles. I was done long after the Beatles were done, and that's a fact. 1.5 out of 5.
Wow, I haven't seen your review yet, Mitchell. So I'm curious to actually read that.
2.
Gloria?
Dude.
Well, you know me, I'm a talker, so I have like 3 different things I would like to say.
Yeah.
I will rapid fire them. Number 1, the opening shot where he's underwater. First of all, don't like that. Don't like when you look like you're drowning. That's not fun. But the typeface, and here comes the graphic design knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
Looked very similar to Finding Nemo.
Yeah.
And it was underwater. And I looked at Zach and I was like, "That looks like Finding Nemo." He was like, "Yeah, it kind of does." So I was like, "I'm not crazy," because Mr. Film himself agreed with me. So I was like, okay. Second thing, I loved the wardrobe. Don't know how accurate any of the wardrobe choices were, because I haven't studied British fashion in the 60s, but there were a few different like jackets or shirts, or like even I think some jewelry that I was like, "Ooh, that's really fun." Specifically the fur coat, which Zach literally wears, and with the Lennon glasses, like Zach was just cosplaying John for.
Oh no, you've outed me.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah, so I thought that was really fun. Okay, the other thing I was thinking, and this is only a thought I had like in the last 30 minutes, was that we were talking about if it had been more installments of or like part of a series, this movie. But now I'm thinking, I'm like, what if it was a part of like a 4-part thing, and it was 1 episode from each of their perspectives in the band? Because it was such a tumultuous time in the band. Like, they were all I mean, from the looks of it, from the one perspective that we got, it looked like they were like all into it except for John. Now, like George, again, I, like Zach said, I don't remember him saying a whole like sentence at all. So like, would love to know what's going on up there because they did not show it at all. Yeah, I don't know. That's pretty much it. The Nemo font was really throwing me. I was like, what kind of film is this?
Well, I think your point about the different perspectives is very appropriate, Gloria, because there is going to be there are going to be 4 movies.
I was waiting for you to say
I think in
this.
2027 that do just
Wow.
that, where they talk
They should
about each
hire
of their
me.
perspectives.
They should hire
You should
me,
make
guys.
the poster.
I was gonna say
The 4
I know so
posters.
much about filmmaking. No, the 4 posters. Oh my gosh, they need to work together. Ready? So they're like this in a little square, and they all need to have some sort of thing in the background that unifies them.
Oh, where they link together like a puzzle?
Oh yeah.
That would be
And
really
if you
cool.
if you put them together in a different way, it makes a different thing.
Oh.
I kind of worry they might do something really boring where each of the posters, they just do the cover to let it be. But for each movie,
Yeah.
they're all blanked out except for the one that the movie's about.
They
I
could
think that would
also
be.
do that for Hard Day's Night or a couple other albums.
Boo.
Yeah, I think
Jeez, he has
2 out of
loaded up.
5 from me. I didn't particularly enjoy this, which was a shame because I've been looking forward to it for a while.
Yikes.
My final kind of thought, I think it's rather appropriate we're recording this on the day that we are because just this morning they dropped the trailer for Midas Man, which is the biopic of Brian Epstein that's going to be coming out either later this year or next year. Who knows if that'll be especially good, but Brian is kind of the one of the best things in this. So, and he usually doesn't really get his flowers when people talk about the Beatles unless they're big fans. So it'll be interesting to see that in a big motion picture that's about him more than it is about the Beatles. Yeah. So without further ado, I guess we can move on to the rundown. Now, for new viewers, this is a segment we've been doing for a while. We switched over to Christian, and I think we switched over to Mitchell at some point as well, where one of us gets assailed with various terms and comments from the movie and has to give them a rating out of 5, rapid fire. It doesn't really mean much. A lot of it's quite arbitrary, but it's just a bit of fun, mate. So I'm gonna book it.
Yes. I remember something George said, but it's the second thing Mitchell's going to say in the rundown, so I'm not going to reveal it now. So the order we'll go in, we're going to go Mitchell, myself, Gloria. Mitchell, myself, Gloria. Rinse and repeat. And yeah, 1 minute to do as much as we can. Are we all ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Mitchell will start us in 3, 2, 1, go.
What are we? Some kind of Lennon Naked?
4 out of 5.
Casting a 56-year-old man to play late 20s John Lennon.
2 out of 5.
Mr. Lennon.
4 out of 5.
She's not a Beatle.
3 out of 5.
Shut up, George.
4 out of 5.
Thinking about acorns.
2 out of 5.
Manic Pixie Yoko Ono.
4 out of 5.
The Beatles being John's band, not Paul's band.
2 out of 5.
Julian Lennon.
3 out of 5.
Having your Brian.
4 out of 5.
No one doing double albums apart from Dylan.
4 out of 5.
Wait, that's just Christopher Eccleston.
4 out of 5.
Wait, that's just Andrew Scott.
3 out of 5.
A deep and clear experience of being.
3 out of 5.
Jesus getting them in trouble.
4 out of 5.
Howling.
4 out of 5.
Declaring the balloons high.
2 out of 5.
Long-haired teddy boys.
4 out of 5.
Winston.
2 seconds.
3 out of 5.
Time.
Okay.
Boo. 2
Yes.
left.
I thought it was weird that there's the one bit where George is like calling out Yoko, and that's all he ever says.
That is a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is because they needed to give that line to somebody who hadn't spoken yet. And they thought, you haven't, we're paying you a speaking rate, right? Who are you playing again? So, alrighty. Well, I guess that wraps up our discussion on Lennon Naked. Thank you for being here with us today, Gloria. Is there anything
Yes.
you'd like to plug or to mention or drop your socials before we transition to our trailer for the next episode?
I was not expecting that. I do.
I should have mentioned this.
I mean, Yeah, you should have. Good job.
Another one.
I mean, I do have an Instagram for my artwork. I don't post on it frequently. At ghealy.art. Healy is Healy, not like the shoes, which is spelled differently. Yeah, I mean, if your fan base knows that I do all of your stuff, so if I ever have any artwork, Zach put it on City Mist.
Nice.
Yeah, that's it. That's all I got.
That's a good point, actually. I didn't mention Gloria designed the new City Mist logo that's been on the YouTube channel for about a year at this point.
Wow, finally getting my credit. I sound so bitter in this. I'm sorry. I hope people know that I'm nice to you sometimes.
We'll fix
This
it
is
in
playing
post.
great. It's
Oh,
playing great.
yeah. Mhm, yeah.
All right. Well, I think Christian is hosting our next episode. What are we going to be talking about next time, Christian?
Right. Yeah, I almost backpedaled on this, but I planned this one a while ago, and I decided I'm sticking to my guns, literally. I think a season ago, I landed on a war film called The Best Years of Our Lives, in large part because I really wanted to show it to Mitchell, because I thought Mitchell would really like it. And good news, I was right about that one.
Success.
I'm a little less sure that I'll be right about this, but I still want to show it to him. This film is called Gallipoli, and it's a Peter Weir film. Peter Weir is probably best known for Dead Poets Society and The Truman Show, among some others. But I really loved Gallipoli when I saw it. It stars a young Mel Gibson, so we're we're not going to draw too much attention to that. But it's a very sensitive portrayal of some young soldiers in World War I, and I think it's a really strong anti-war movie, one that I think Mitchell has to see. So we're going to see it here.
Gallipoli was a epic, underrated battle. It makes Winston Churchill look terrible.
I'm off
So
to a
it's
good
very
start.
interesting.
If it makes Churchill look bad, then I've got Zach on board too.
And I know next to nothing about this battle or this movie. I expected this to be a big war epic, but looking up images to make the thumbnail, I really didn't see much of anything of fighting or combat. So I'm very interested in where this is going to go. So tune in next time if you'd like to hear us talk about Gallipoli. Thank you for being here with us this evening, Gloria. And this has been us from Cookie Pocket.